I love telling you Bloomberg is no longer the mayor of New York. I can't wait till the day comes I tell you Chuck Schumer lost an election.
Oh.
And that Californians woke up and Nancy Pelosi is now history.
Don't forget Dick Durbin.
Oh, my goodness. I try not to even think about that guy. I can't wait to tell you that Harry Reid decided to move to Costa Rica and retire. I can't wait to tell you about the results of the 2014 midterms. Because I'm excited about 2014. I think great things are on the horizon for gun owners in America. I think great things are on the horizon for freedom lovers in America. Beginning in 2014, I see Americans waking up. I see more discussion. I see gun owners very alert, more alert than we have ever been. Gun owners are far more awake today than they were in 2012 and in 2008. And that will not bode well for those politicians who are attempting to run on gun control or think they're going to be able to run on a gun control agenda in 2014 and beyond.
This segment of Armed American Radio is being brought to you by the Gun Owners of America, America's no-compromise gun lobby. Become a member today. Visit gunowners.org. Join them, folks. I did. Welcome back.
I am always proud to bring you my next guest, John R. Lott, Jr. He is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, author of the More Guns, Less Crime, now in its third edition, books, which if you haven't read, you need to. Talking about education, these books will open your eyes as never before. John is also a Fox News contributor and author of many other books and a good friend of this program. John, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks for having me on.
John, you have a piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer today, and you talk a little bit about the new year bringing more gun control regulations. It's not a shock to me or anybody that listens to the show, I don't think. But Obama announced new executive orders according to your piece on background checks. Connecticut citizens, as you know, have stood in long lines to register their guns, and next door in New York City, registration lists are used to confiscate them. That's coming from your piece. Can you elaborate on some of that?
Well, there have been a lot of new laws going into effect on January 1st from California to New York and other places. And I think the one common feature, if we were to talk about that with regard to these laws, is to make it costly for people to obtain, to own guns or to obtain ammunition. We've had a lot of changes over the last year. If you want to go and buy ammunition in New York, you have to pay an $85 fee each time you go there on average, because that's what the cost of going through a background check through an FFL in the state is.
Wow.
If you want to go and obtain a concealed handgun permit, now you can in Illinois, but even there it's something that costs about $650 to go through the training and licensing requirements that are there, maybe as much as $700. In Maryland, if you want to license and register a handgun, it's going to cost you about $350 to go through the training and everything else that's required. And you go through these different costs, and I think one of the big features of them is just to reduce gun ownership, and to particularly reduce gun ownership among the types of people who benefit the most from owning guns, and that tends to be people who are most likely to be victims. Poor, minorities who live in high-crime urban areas are the ones who Democrats seem to particularly want to make sure can't pay for everything to go and own a weapon for self-defense. And the irony is that these are the people Democrats claim that they want to go and help. And yet even when amendments are offered to their bills that would go and say, okay, let's exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay all these fees and taxes, Democrats will vote in unison against exempting them from having to pay that. And so, you're kind of left with no other explanation, I think, than they just don't want those individuals particularly to own these guns. But, we have registration starting in Connecticut, and unfortunately, what Americans have learned and people around the world have learned time after time when registration is imposed is that it often is used to go and confiscate guns at some other point, which is, one just has to look next door in New York City to see how registration there is being used to take away people's weapons. But California had that happen a couple times in just the last decade. We've had Chicago use its registration to take weapons away, and New York has done that previously.
Can you tie that in the registration in Connecticut for us. Let's go to the new proposed executive action or the regulation, making it easier to dig into privacy or to avoid the HIPAA requirements and put mental health records in, because the message here is, well, what's wrong with keeping guns out of the hands of mentally ill? Let's use these records, make sure they get in. Now we know where everybody's guns are. How slippery of a slope is that?
Just back up a second here. I think the important thing is to take what the claim is for why registration is so important. And the main claim for registration is to try to help solve crimes. That if a criminal registers a gun, or a gun's registered to somebody who commits a crime, and the gun is left at the crime scene, then in theory you can go and trace the gun back to the criminal and figure out who committed the crime. The problem is that well, we've done registration. It hasn't been used to solve crimes, whether it be in Washington, D.C., or Chicago, or Hawaii, which has had registration and licensing laws for well over 50 years, or Canada. Recently, they finally got rid of their long gun registration. One of the facts that came out is that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police couldn't point to any crimes, whether it be with handguns or long guns, that have been solved as a result of the registration there. And the reason is pretty simple, and that is, one, crime guns are almost never left at the scene. And the few times that they are left at the scene, it's because the criminal has been either killed or seriously wounded, so you're going to solve the crime anyway. And the few guns that are left at the scene are not registered, usually, and the very few that are registered guns aren't registered to the people who committed the crime. And so you bear all this cost. In Hawaii, I had to testify in 2000, and one of the things that came out was the police chief for just Honolulu said that it took about 50,000 hours worth of police time each year to go and handle the registration process. That's 50,000 hours in just a year that could be used to do things that we know work for police. My research, if anybody's read More Guns, Less Crime or The Bias Against Guns, knows that I believe that police are extremely important in reducing crime, probably the single most important factor. But that, here we're having them do something that's useless and taking them away from valuable activities that we know work. And that's a real cost. So there's a cost to this registration, and if you're going to bear that cost, you'd like to hopefully see some benefit from it. And the fact that you don't see these benefits, this is the type of discussion I know Dick Heller is involved in other legal cases. These are the types of empirical things that I'd like to see being brought up before the court when it's going to be deciding about registration. I know they're talking about this lack of benefits, but there's this whole set of costs, and there's empirical issues with regard to those that I hope in the discovery process that they've gone through and documented all those things. So that's kind of one general issue with regard to registration. Now, with regard to background checks, that's a somewhat different issue. You don't have to have registration in order to have background checks going on there. The thing is, there's a lot of empirical evidence that's been done, and consistently you just don't find benefits from background checks. There are lots of ways for people to be able to go and obtain guns illegally. And the problem is that the current background check system is just a complete mess. Virtually everybody who gets stopped from obtaining a gun because of a background check is a false positive. I mean, you can go to crimeresearch.org to get more details on this, but if you go through the data from the annual NICS reports, you'll see for 2010, for example, there are about 76,000 initial denials. Only 42 of those resulted in prosecutions, right, and there were only 13 convictions. Look, there are real costs for having background checks. One of the big costs is just the number of law-abiding citizens who are falsely denied being able to go and obtain guns. When you're talking about months of delays, and the president, when he says there are 2 million prohibited people prevented from buying guns, he's simply not being accurate. What the correct terminology is that there have been 2 million initial denials. But there's a huge difference between an initial denial and a prohibited person prevented from buying a gun. Now, I'd give you a simple example. The late Senator Ted Kennedy, some people may know that he was on the no-fly list 5 times. 5 times he was stopped from flying on a plane because somebody who they really did want to stop had a name that was similar to his. But I assume we wouldn't count that as 5 times that we've stopped a terrorist from flying on a plane. But that's essentially when they say 2 million prohibited people prevented, that's the way they're counting them then, rather than just saying, look, it was an initial denial. And when you're talking about 2 million people, and virtually all of them being false positives, there's probably some of those people who really need to get a gun quickly for self-defense who weren't able to do so. And so the cost is that some individuals weren't able to defend themselves and may have been harmed or killed as a result of those delays in the background check system. And rather than going and just expanding it, I think the first thing we ought to do is try to, if you're going to have a background check, is to fix it. Now, they may not want to pay for the amount of money that would be there to fix. And the other issue is who should pay for the background checks. If gun control advocates are correct that there's this big gain from it, even though they can't point to any evidence, but let's say they're right, then it's a benefit in terms of reduced crime that would accrue to everybody, not just the people who are buying the guns. And so everybody should pay for that benefit, not just a small group of people who are buying guns in a particular year. And so it should be paid for out of general revenue. It shouldn't be paid for out of fees imposed on gun buyers. But you bring that up to gun control advocate groups like the Brady Campaign or Bloomberg or whatever, they'll go nuts on that point, even though they claim that everybody's benefiting from those background checks. So I just think a careful discussion of these costs and benefits need to be talked about rather than just saying there's a benefit, therefore we must do something about it, because they ignore important costs that are there. Otherwise, I worry that they end up accomplishing the opposite of what they'd like to do. Now, with regard to your other question about what's the goal, unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion over time that it's just to make it costly, difficult for people to own guns, reduce the number of people who own guns. I mean, it's the reason why they don't do simple things like fix the problems with the background check system. If they really cared about just trying to stop criminals, they'd fix these problems. But they have no desire to fix these problems. And I think if they make it costly for people to own guns and reduce the number of law-abiding gun owners, then in the future it makes it easier for them to push for other types of rules. And things like registration, I think, are just one way of making it so that they can confiscate guns at some point in the future.
Well, it would seem that would be the logical conclusion that we can draw from your research over many, many, many years, is that if, in fact, what they are attempting to do doesn't work, we can clearly draw the logical conclusion that what they're doing is setting the stage for being able to come and get your guns at some point down the road, and they're willing to wait years and in many cases decade to do that. They're doing this step by step. John, in the essence of time, I want to ask you about the Detroit police chief who came out in favor of armed citizens helping his force stop crime.
Yeah, I have links at crimeresearch.org and other things, but it's great that someone from a liberal city, heavily Democratic city, and a black police chief would come out and say very clearly that allowing more law-abiding citizens to have guns will create less crime. It's something that police chiefs generally believe. If you believe the National Association of Chiefs of Police, their survey indicates about 95% of their members think that concealed handgun laws are important for reducing crime. But to have someone in a politically appointed position in such a liberal city come out and say how important this is, I think makes a difference in terms of changing the debate that's there. And you've had other people. You've had David Clark and the sheriff for Milwaukee in Wisconsin come out and make similar types of statements. And if my research in More Guns, Less Crime convinces me of anything, it's that those people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to defend themselves. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas. And having people in the police chief in Detroit or the sheriff in Milwaukee or other places come out and make the types of public statements that they do in such heavily minority areas, I think will hopefully begin to have some serious discussion about this topic and hopefully get tied back to the stuff that we talked about at the beginning of the show, and that is how in so many areas Democrats try to make it very costly for these very people to be able to go and get guns. If you look at someplace like Washington, D.C., where Dick Heller is from, it costs, according to the Washington Post, $534 to go through the licensing and registration process.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. John, I want to thank you for joining me, and I know it was on short notice. Thank you so much. The logic and wisdom from you is needed, and people need to hear what it is that you tell us. Well, and that your research shows. Thank you very much. More guns, less crime. More guns, less crime. Now in its third edition, make sure you pick a copy of that up.
We also had gun registration. Oh, the Austrian people they all had guns. But the government said the guns are very dangerous. Children are playing with guns, hunting accidents happen, and we really have to have total control, safety. And we had criminals again. And the only way that we can trace the criminal was by the serial number of the gun. So we dutifully went to the police station and we registered our guns. Not long after, they said, no, it didn't help. The only way that we don't have accidents and crimes, you bring the guns to the police station and then we don't have any crimes anymore and any accidents. And if you don't do that, capital punishment.
We need to do this every day of the week and just really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way.
It's not about keeping guns out of the hands of law-abiding Americans, and I'm sick and tired of people lying to the American people.
We can't have a totally armed society.
We're not proposing a gun registration system. We're proposing background checks for criminals.
In the spirit of gun control, will you disarm your entire security team?
We'll get right back to you.
You'll get back to me?
Hitler took the guns. Stalin took the guns. Mao took the guns. Fidel Castro took the guns. Hugo Chavez took the guns. And I'm here to tell you, 1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms. Doesn't matter how many lemmings you get out there on the street begging for them to have their guns taken. We will not relinquish them. Do you understand? And that's why you're going to fail, and the establishment knows no matter how much propaganda, the Republic will rise again when you attempt to take our guns.